Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. I used to think cemeteries were honest places, no pretense. Everyone there was exactly what they were, dead, remembered, or forgotten. That belief is why I accepted the job so easily, and why I trusted the man who offered it to me without asking enough questions. My name is Caleb, and for 3 months last fall I worked nights as an assistant groundskeeper at Willow Ridge Cemetery. It wasn't official work. No payroll, no badge, just cash paid weekly by my mother's old friend Thomas Hale. Everyone called him Tom. He'd been the head grave digger there for decades, long enough that his name was etched into the place as deeply as the dates on the stones. He told me I'd be helping with cleanup, monitoring vandalism, and keeping an eye on things after dark. I needed money. I was grieving. I said yes. The first night felt almost peaceful. The cemetery sat on a low hill outside town, surrounded by skeletal trees that rattled softly when the wind passed through them. The air smelled like damp earth and old leaves. Headstones leaned at tired angles, their inscriptions softened by time. There was a comfort in the stillness, in knowing nothing was expected of me except to walk, listen, and exist. Tom met me at the maintenance shed just before dusk. He handed me a thermos of coffee and clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder like we were family. He joked about ghosts and told me I'd get used to the sounds soon enough. The ground settles at night, he said. You hear things shift. Doesn't mean anything. For the first week, nothing did mean anything. I walked the paths with a flashlight, learned the names on the newer graves, memorized the locations of the old crypts. I started to recognize which owls nested where, and which stones always looked wet no matter the weather. I even started to like the isolation. After my father died, quiet felt safer than people. The red flags were small enough to dismiss. The first was my pocket knife. I always carried it, my dad's old one, with a chipped black handle. One night I reached into my jacket to cut some twine and it was gone. I figured I'd dropped it near a grave or left it in the shed. I told Tom and he shrugged. Graveyard eats things, he said. You'll see. Then my notebook disappeared. I kept it tucked into my backpack where I wrote down odd maintenance issues and thoughts I didn't want in my head. One night it simply wasn't there. No torn fabric, no spilled contents, just gone. Tom laughed when I asked him about it. You're tired, he said. Working nights messes with your head. I started sleeping badly after that. I'd hear dirt shifting in my dreams, hear breathing too close to my ear at work. The sounds followed me, soft scuffs near the older graves. A wet dragging noise near Section D, where the ground always seemed looser than it should have been. When I shined my light, there was never anything there. Just disturbed soil that Tom insisted was settling. Once I heard someone humming. It was faint, tuneless, and coming from near the children's section. I stood frozen, telling myself it was wind or animals, or my imagination chewing on my nerves. When I told Tom, he went quiet for a moment too long. Then he told me not to wander there after midnight. Bad memories stick to places like that, he said. You don't want them sticking to you. Things escalated slowly, like the place was testing how much I'd tolerate. My boots went missing from the shed one night, replaced by another pair 2 sizes too big, caked in mud that smelled wrong, sweet and rotten. My phone battery drained impossibly fast whenever I checked the time near the older graves. I started finding dirt under my fingernails when I woke up, even on days I hadn't worked. The worst part was Tom's behavior. He started showing up later, leaving earlier. When I asked questions, he shut them down. He told me I was imagining patterns, that grief did strange things. Once, when I pressed him about the sounds, his face hardened in a way I hadn't seen before. You don't want to know everything that happens here, he said. Trust me. I didn't trust him anymore. Not after I found the key. It was in my jacket pocket, heavy and cold. Not mine. I didn't remember picking it up. It had a small tag tied to it with twine S9. Section 9 was an older part of the cemetery, rarely visited, with several unmarked plots. When I asked Tom about it, he snatched it from my hand. His fingers were shaking. You didn't see that, he said. That night I followed him. He didn't notice me at first. He was moving fast for a man his age, carrying a lantern instead of a flashlight. He unlocked the gate to Section 9 and disappeared among the stones. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it would give me away. I waited, then crept after him. I found the shed. It was half buried into the hill, hidden behind a row of mausoleums I'd never bothered to inspect closely. The door was old, warped, but the lock was new. Inside, the air was thick and damp. My flashlight beam caught on shelves stacked with notebooks, plastic-wrapped bundles, and labeled jars filled with things I didn't want to identify. One notebook lay open on a table. My handwriting stared back at me. It wasn't just my words, it was my thoughts. Things I'd never written down, fears I'd only felt. Dates and times matched my shifts. There were photographs, too, of me walking the paths, of me sleeping in the shed chair, of dirt under my nails, and worse. Photos of open graves that weren't on any schedule. Their depths measured and annotated. That's when I understood the betrayal. Tom hadn't hired me to help. He'd been studying me, preparing me. The sound behind me was soft but deliberate. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, blocking the light. His expression wasn't angry. It was disappointed. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," he said. I don't remember everything that happened after. I remember shouting. I remember him saying the ground needed witnesses, that some people were meant to listen. I remember running, tripping over a grave that hadn't been there before, feeling hands brush my ankle from below the soil. The police didn't find the shed. They said Section 9 had always been empty. Tom was gone. His house was empty too, like he'd never lived there at all. They suggested stress, grief, hallucinations. I quit town 2 days later. I thought it was over. Last week I found my pocket knife on my bedside table, clean sharpened, a tag tied to it with twine S10, and my phone rang for the first time in months. No number, just a voice breathing on the other end, humming softly, like the ground settling beneath me. People always think traditions are harmless just because they're familiar. That if something has been done the same way for generations, it can't possibly be dangerous. I used to believe that too, and I still get defensive when outsiders criticize my family for what we do. They don't understand the rules. They don't understand how carefully everything was designed, or how something can follow the rules perfectly and still turn against you. My family has taken care of Black Hollow Cemetery for as long as anyone remembers. Not officially, not on paper. It's just something we do. My grandfather used to say the dead deserve witnesses, and since the town forgot them, we volunteered. Birthdays, holidays, random weekends, we'd all meet after sunset and do our rounds together. Parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, lanterns in hand, radios clipped to our belts, always together. There were rules, strict ones. We followed them like scripture. Rule 1, never walk alone. You stayed in your assigned pair. No exceptions, no shortcuts. Rule 2, lanterns only. No flashlights. Batteries fail too easily. Flames don't lie. Rule 3, if you hear your name, you check your radio first. If no one answers, you don't respond. Rule 4, no one enters the Old North section after midnight. Rule 5, if something feels off, you don't announce it. You leave quietly. I didn't question any of this growing up. It was just how things were. The cemetery felt familiar, almost comforting, the way a childhood home does even when it's falling apart. I knew which stones leaned, which angels were missing fingers, which graves always smelled damp no matter the season. The first time I was allowed to fully participate was the summer I turned 16. Up until then, I'd stayed close to my mother, holding her lantern while she checked markers and cleared debris. That night, they gave me my own lantern, my own radio, and paired me with my cousin Mark. He'd been doing this for years and treated it like a game, whispering jokes and daring shadows to move. At first, it was almost fun. We followed the gravel paths, called in status checks every 15 minutes like we were supposed to. Pair 3, all clear, I said, trying to sound confident. The radio crackled back with familiar voices. My uncle, my mom, all exactly where they should have been. The cemetery responded the way it always did. Wind through the trees, insects clicking, stone settling, nothing threatening, nothing wrong. About an hour in, Mark stopped joking. He tilted his lantern toward a row of older graves and frowned. Was that marker always broken? He asked. I looked where he was pointing. A headstone lay snapped clean in half, edges sharp and pale, like it had just been broken. I was sure it hadn't been like that before. We logged it over the radio. My uncle told us we'd check it in daylight. We should have left it at that. As we moved deeper, the air felt heavier, like breathing through wet cloth. My lantern flame flickered, not from wind, but like it was being tugged. Then we heard footsteps behind us, measured. Slow, too heavy to be an animal. I did what I was trained to do. I checked my radio. Pair 3, hearing movement behind us. I whispered static. Then my mother's voice came through, calm. Copy that. Probably Mark's uncle doubling back. Except Mark's uncle was with pair 1, nowhere near us. Mark turned, raising his lantern. The footsteps stopped. There was nothing there, no one. Just disturbed gravel leading between the stones, as if something had walked through and then decided to stop existing. I wanted to leave, I didn't say it. Rule 5. The realization came quietly. We started noticing things that didn't belong. Extra lantern light flickering between trees where no one was assigned. A radio call using my grandfather's voice even though he'd been dead for 6 years. Shadows that matched our movements half a second too late. The worst moment was when we regrouped near the central monument for a head count. Everyone was there. Everyone accounted for. And one extra. He stood just behind my aunt, close enough that she should have felt him breathing. He wore our family's old caretaker jacket, the one we retired decades ago. His lantern burned low and blue. When he smiled at me, I felt something cold uncoil in my stomach. Not until he spoke. He said my name. Not over the radio, out loud. That's when the chase started. He moved fast, impossibly fast, lantern light streaking between stones as he ran. We scattered, breaking rules we'd never broken before. I could hear Mark behind me gasping, slipping on wet grass. I could hear radios screaming with overlapping voices, panic cracking through decades of discipline. I don't know how long I ran. I only know I didn't stop until I hit the road and collapsed, lungs burning. The others emerged one by one, shaken, silent. We never spoke about what we saw. We didn't need to. We stopped the rounds after that. Told ourselves it was over. Told ourselves the rules had failed us, not the place. Last night I found my lantern on my porch. The old one, the flame inside burned low and blue. Tied to the handle was a tag written in my grandfather's handwriting. This Rule 6. Don't forget who watches when you leave. I wouldn't have gone anywhere near a cemetery if I hadn't been desperate. Money has a way of pushing your comfort zone outward until it tears. After my hours were cut at work and my rent went up in the same month, I started looking for anything that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions. That's how I found the listing buried deep in a local forum. Overnight caretaking help needed. Rural cemetery, short-term stay provided, discretion appreciated. It sounded strange, sure, but also easy. 2 nights of monitoring an old graveyard slated for restoration. No digging, no security work beyond keeping an eye out. $500 cash? For me, that was groceries, utilities, and breathing room. I convinced myself the creep factor was just atmosphere. I wasn't alone. The post asked for a small group, and I ended up responding with 3 others. Jenna, who needed money for vet bills; Marcus, who treated everything like a joke; and Eerie, quiet, observant, always watching instead of talking. None of us knew each other well, but desperation has a way of making strangers feel like allies. The location was sent the day before we left. No address, just coordinates and instructions to meet our host, Mr. Calder, at a gas station an hour outside the city. He was already there when we arrived, leaning against a dusty pickup, smiling too easily. He didn't give us his first name, just handed over keys and rules. Stay within the grounds, log anything unusual. No visitors after dark, simple. The cemetery sat miles from anything recognizable, down a narrow road swallowed by trees. The entrance gate hung crooked, rusted open as if it hadn't been closed in years. Headstones stretched farther than I expected, uneven and crowded, some so old the names were barely scars in stone. A small caretaker's house sat near the center, squat and windowless on one side, like it had turned its back on something. The first day was almost pleasant. Sunlight filtered through branches. Birds hopped between stones, and the place felt more forgotten than threatening. We unpacked, joked, explored. Marcus kept pretending to jump scare us from behind mausoleums. Jenna told him to knock it off. Eli wandered farther than the rest of us, studying the older sections, tracing symbols carved into markers. That night, things shifted. The air grew heavy once the sun dipped, sounds dulling as if wrapped in cloth. Our phones lost signal entirely. We told ourselves that was normal, rural dead zones and all that. We set up shifts like Calder suggested, 2 awake at a time, log everything. Around midnight, I saw the first light. It wasn't lantern light or headlights. It hovered low between graves, pale and steady, moving with intention. When I pointed it out, Marcus laughed and said it was probably someone's drone. But there was no hum, no mechanical sound, just silence and that slow drift. Jenna radioed Calder like we were told. He answered immediately, voice calm, almost rehearsed. Probably reflections, he said. The stones play tricks at night. The next day, tension crept in through small cracks. Marcus swore someone had moved his backpack. Jenna accused him of messing with her. Eerie mentioned hearing footsteps near the caretaker's house long after everyone was accounted for. I started feeling watched, not in a dramatic way, but like standing too close to someone in line and sensing their breath. The first real incident happened the second night. I was on shift with Eli when we heard knocking. Slow, deliberate, coming from beneath the floorboards of the house. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Eli froze, eyes wide. We didn't have a basement. Calder had been clear about that. Then the lights went out, not flickered. Out. Total darkness. Broken only by moonlight through the window. From outside, something scraped against the walls like nails on wood. We heard whispers, too low to understand, circling the house. When the power came back, the front door was open. Mud tracked across the floor in long, dragging smears. On the wall, written in dirt, was a message: "Yo orestiento a lunge." We packed to leave immediately, all of us. But when we reached the gate, it was closed, chained tight, a fresh lock glinting in the dark. No one admitted to doing it. Our phones still had no signal. The lights in the cemetery flickered on one by one, even in sections without fixtures. We called Calder again. This time, he didn't sound surprised. "I told you to log everything," he said, "not interfere." The escape was chaos. We cut the chain with tools from the shed and drove until the road turned familiar again. The police took statements, searched the area. They found no lights, no messages, no sign anyone had been there but us. Calder never answered another call. Weeks later, I checked the forum. The listing was gone. The coordinates led nowhere, just forest. When I asked the local clerk about the cemetery, he frowned and said no one was officially responsible for it anymore. Then he added quietly, "People still try to watch it sometimes. No one ever stays long." He wouldn't tell me why. My grandmother Ruth never talked about the cemetery, even though everyone in town knew she spent more time there than she did at home. When she died, that silence became my inheritance. She left me the house first, an old, narrow place with sagging floors and a view of the hill where Briar Hollow Cemetery sat, its iron gates visible between the trees. The second thing she left me was everything else. 6 boxes labeled only with dates, a ring of keys so old some of them no longer matched any locks I could find. and a handwritten note that said, "You'll need to finish what I started." At the time, I thought it was just grief talking. My grandmother had been sharp until the end, but death has a way of making final words feel heavier than they should. I told myself the cemetery was just a hobby for her, volunteering, tending forgotten graves, something lonely people do to feel useful. I didn't yet understand that she hadn't been visiting the cemetery. She'd been maintaining it. The first week after the funeral, I focused on the house, sorting clothes, donating furniture, avoiding the boxes. But they seemed to watch me from the corner of the living room, stacked neatly, patient. When I finally opened the first one, the smell hit me before I saw anything. Old paper, damp soil, something faintly metallic. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them, each page filled with tight, meticulous handwriting. Names, dates, grave numbers, symbols drawn in the margins. Some entries were crossed out violently, engorging the paper. Others were circled again and again like she'd been afraid they'd escape the page. The second box held tools, not gardening tools, not exactly. Brushes, small trowels worn smooth, candles wrapped in cloth, jars filled with dirt labeled by section and date. One jar was warm when I touched it. I dropped it and the glass didn't break. That night I heard footsteps outside my bedroom window. I told myself it was an animal. The house backed up to woods after all. But the steps were slow, deliberate, circling. When I looked out, the yard was empty. Still, when I turned back, there was dirt on my windowsill, pressed into the paint like fingerprints. Things continued like that, small enough to dismiss if I tried hard enough. The keys on the ring would rearrange themselves overnight. I'd find cemetery dirt in my shoes even if I hadn't left the house. Once, while washing dishes, I saw my reflection behind me in the window glass, standing too close, smiling the way my grandmother used to when she was keeping a secret. I started reading the ledgers. They weren't journals, they were records. My grandmother had been tracking disturbances in Briar Hollow Cemetery for over 40 years. Graves that sank too fast, coffins that shifted, sounds reported by nearby residents. Every time something settled, she wrote it down. Every time it didn't, she marked it with a symbol I didn't recognize at first. It took research to understand what she'd been involved in. Old town archives, church records, a forgotten historical society pamphlet that mentioned Briar Hollow being built over an older burial ground, one that predated the town and had been abandoned improperly. The dead there weren't consecrated, they weren't moved. My grandmother hadn't just been watching, she'd been compensating. The symbols were containment marks. The jars of dirt were taken from specific graves during specific lunar phases. The candles were used to reset boundaries. She'd created a system to keep what was buried from realizing how thin the barrier had become. And she'd been doing it alone. Once I understood that, the manifestations escalated. Doors began opening on their own, always facing the hill. My dreams filled with cramped spaces and the sensation of soul pressing against my ribs. At work, I'd catch myself writing symbols from the ledgers in the margins of my notes without realizing it. The cemetery called to me in ways that felt less like sound and more like obligation. When I skipped a night, didn't go up the hill like the ledgers instructed, the consequences were immediate. A sinkhole opened near Section C. A neighbor reported hearing screaming from underground. The ground near the gates cracked, exposing old wood that should never have been visible. I tried to stop it, tried to sell the house, tried to donate the boxes to a university archive. Nothing worked. The house wouldn't pass inspection. The boxes reappeared every time I removed them. One night I burned a ledger in the fireplace. The ashes spelled my name by morning. Eventually, I accepted what my grandmother had known for decades. This wasn't something that could be undone. It could only be managed. Passed down, I follow her routines now. I walk the cemetery at night with her tools. I record what moves and what stays still. I correct what I can and apologize for what I can't. The town thinks I'm strange, the way they thought she was strange. Someone has to stay close. Last week I found a new box in the living room, smaller than the others. Inside was a ledger with my handwriting on the first page, dated 10 years from now. On the last page, already written, was a note I don't remember leaving behind: make sure they inherit the keys. I took the job because I was running out of excuses not to. My savings were gone, my credit cards were maxed, and every normal application ended with an automated rejection email. When the listing appeared on a local job board, I ignored it at first. Overnight cemetery operations assistant, no company logo, no HR contact, just a phone number and a promise of immediate pay, cash bonuses for reliability, full-time hours, no background check. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd quit as soon as something better came along. I called. The interview lasted 10 minutes and consisted mostly of whether I could follow instructions without asking questions. The supervisor, a woman named Lorraine, spoke in a flat, professional tone that reminded me of hospital staff delivering bad news. She didn't ask about my experience. She asked if I was squeamish, if I could work nights indefinitely, and if I understood that some responsibilities were non-disclosure by necessity. I started the following Monday. The cemetery was older than the town around it, sprawling and uneven, with sections clearly added and stages as space ran out and priorities shifted. The main office sat near the gate, modern and fluorescent, lit, clashing badly with the stones outside. Inside, I met the rest of the overnight crew, 3 men and 1 woman, all quiet, all exhausted in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. Training was procedural, not practical. We didn't talk about why things were done, only how. Checkpoints every hour, logs filled out by hand, never digitally. Radios tested at the start of each shift and then kept on at all times, volume high. If you heard something strange, you documented it. You didn't investigate unless instructed. Some areas were off limits. Entire sections of the cemetery cordoned off with temporary fencing and signs marked maintenance only. I asked what kind of maintenance required armed security cameras and motion sensors buried in the ground. Lorraine stared at me until I apologized. The protocols got stranger the longer I stayed. We weren't allowed to whistle. We weren't allowed to sit directly on the ground. We weren't allowed to respond to voices unless they came through the radio and used the correct call sign. There were drills for containment breaches that no one would explain, and there was a clause in the contract, buried deep in legal language, that tied my final paycheck to successful completion of the probationary period, which could be extended indefinitely at management's discretion. People quit, or tried to. One guy, Aaron, didn't come back after his 3rd shift. Lorraine said he'd violated protocol. His name disappeared from the schedule by morning. No one asked questions. Another woman lasted 2 weeks, then left her badge on the desk and walked out mid-shift. I heard later that she tried to report the place to the city. The city referred her back to Lorraine. The truth came to me on a fog-heavy night in late October. I was assigned to Section G, one of the restricted areas, paired with a senior employee named Don. He didn't talk much, just gestured for me to follow. The ground there was soft, too soft, sinking slightly underfoot no matter how recently it had been packed. The stones were newer than the rest of the cemetery, but the dates didn't match the burial records I'd seen. We stopped near a grave that was moving, not dramatically, not like in movies, just enough to notice the soil rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Don adjusted a device on his belt, something like a scanner humming softly. "It's early," he muttered.
That's bad.
I wanted to run. Instead, I watched as he drove metal rods into the ground around the grave, forming a rough perimeter. The movement slowed, the soil settled.
That's not supposed to happen.
I said. Don looked at me, eyes bloodshot, expression hollow. It's not supposed to stop either. That was when I understood what the job really was. We weren't guarding the cemetery from vandals or animals. We were guarding everyone else from whatever was buried wrong, buried incomplete, or buried when it wasn't ready. When I told Lorraine I wanted out, she nodded sympathetically. Then she showed me the contract. The penalties for breach were severe, financial, legal, and, she added gently, there are consequences we don't put in writing. You've already been exposed. I finished my probation. I followed the rules. I watched things move under the earth and learned how to make them stop, at least temporarily. When I finally left, I thought I was free. I was wrong. No other job will keep me. Interviews end abruptly. Background checks stall. And sometimes, late at night, I feel the ground beneath my apartment floor shift, like something recognizing me. I still wake up reaching for a radio I no longer carry. I didn't choose isolation because I wanted to be alone. I chose it because I was told it was safer. The cemetery sat on a bluff above the river, completely cut off once winter set in. When the early storms washed out the access road, management gave me 2 options: leave before the freeze and lose the contract, or stay on site until spring. They framed it like an honor. Someone has to keep watch, they said, and you've already proven reliable. The pay was double. Hazard compensation. Silence bonus. I signed without thinking too hard about what on-site really meant. The caretaker's lodge was small but solid, generator-powered, stocked with canned food, bottled water, medical supplies. There was a radio for scheduled check-ins twice a week, weather permitting. My instructions were simple: remain within the grounds, log activity, do not attempt maintenance beyond marked paths. The cemetery itself was technically closed for the season, which meant no visitors, no burials, no disturbances. At first, it felt like a retreat. I established routines quickly. Wake up. Check the generator, walk the inner loop of graves. Log temperatures, ground conditions, any anomalies. Read. Sleep. The silence was heavy but consistent like a blanket. After a while, I stopped noticing it. The cemetery behaved itself. Snow smoothed the uneven ground, softened the sharp angles of the stones. Wind erased tracks almost as soon as they formed. If I heard something shift beneath the earth, I told myself it was frost heave science. Predictable. My logbooks reflected that calm. Neat handwriting, identical entries day after day, no movement observed, no sound anomalies, all sections stable. That's what I wrote. That's not what happened. The first change was time. My watch started losing minutes. Not hours. Just enough to be irritating. I'd swear I'd just checked it, only to look again and find 10 minutes gone. The lodge clocks didn't agree with each other either. I reset them daily. They drifted anyway. I blamed the cold. Then objects began moving, not disappearing, just shifting slightly. A chair angled differently than I remembered. A mug closer to the edge of the table. Snow piled against the door in patterns that didn't match the wind direction. I told myself isolation messes with perception. That's what the manuals say. The silence deepened. Some nights it felt thick enough to press against my ears. No wind, no animals, not even the distant sound of the river. During those stretches, my thoughts grew loud, looping, repetitive. I started narrating my actions out loud just to anchor myself. I am opening the logbook. I am writing the date. The dates were wrong. I noticed it halfway through January. I'd written the same date 3 days in a row, each entry describing different weather conditions. When I checked the calendar on the wall, entire squares were crossed out that I didn't remember marking. I flipped back through older logs and found entries in handwriting that looked like mine but felt unfamiliar. Slanted differently, pressed harder into the paper. I started questioning my memory, then my sanity. I recorded voice notes to cross-check myself, left messages on the lodge radio, played them back later. Sometimes there were extra ones, breathing, pauses. Once, a whisper that sounded like it was right behind the microphone. Outside confirmation came with footprints. They appeared one morning in the fresh snow, circling the lodge, too large to be mine, too deliberate to be animal. I followed them until they reached the cemetery fence, where they stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist. That night, my radio crackled to life outside the scheduled check and window. My name came through, distorted but clear. I answered instinctively, relief flooding me. The response was wrong, too slow, too careful. It repeated my last words back to me, slightly altered. I broke. I screamed at the empty lodge, tore pages from the logbooks, smashed the clocks. I ran into the cemetery with a flashlight, shouting for whatever was watching to show itself. The snow swallowed my footprints behind me. The stones loomed closer together than they ever had before. I don't remember how I got back inside. Rescue came weeks later when the road finally reopened. The team said I'd been unresponsive for days, that my logs ended abruptly, that I was dehydrated, malnourished, rambling about time folding in on itself. They escorted me out, locked the lodge behind us. Promised counseling, promised answers at home. I tried to rebuild routine, normalcy, but my watch still loses time. My calendar changes overnight, and sometimes when the house goes quiet enough, I hear the same silence I heard on the bluff, thick, patient waiting. Last night I found muddy footprints outside my bedroom door. They stopped just short of the bed. I didn't report it because I wanted attention. I reported it because it was standing half out of the ground, and pretending it wasn't there felt worse than whatever would happen if I spoke. It was just after dawn when I saw it. I was cutting through the cemetery on my way to work, a shortcut I'd taken 100 times without thinking. Fog hung low, thick enough to blur the rows of headstones into a single uneven mass. Near the back fence, where the older graves sloped toward the woods, the ground looked wrong. Not disturbed exactly. Lifted. At first I thought it was erosion. Then the fog shifted and I saw fingers. They weren't reaching. They were hooked into the dirt like claws, knuckles pale, nails packed with soil. The wrist disappeared into the earth at an angle that made my stomach flip. No movement. No sound. Just that impossible detail existing where it shouldn't. I called it in from my phone with shaking hands. I expected confusion, panic. Questions. What I got was speed. 2 police cars arrived within minutes, lights off, no sirens. A third vehicle followed, unmarked, dark windows. The officers who stepped out were calm in a way that felt rehearsed, their movements efficient, unhurried. One of them smiled at me like I'd done a good job. They didn't ask me to repeat what I'd seen. They led me away from the site, asked me to sit on the curb, handed me a bottle of water. Another officer draped a tarp over the area before I could even point. A man in a plain jacket took photos, blocking my view with his body. When I tried to stand, a hand settled gently but firmly on my shoulder. Let us handle it, he said. Their report came fast, too fast. By noon, I was told there had been no body, no remains, no disturbance beyond animal activity. Ground settling, my statement, which I'd been careful with precise, came back summarized into something vague and dismissible. Possible misinterpretation due to fog and lighting conditions. When I objected, they nodded sympathetically. One officer adjusted his badge and told me stress can do strange things. Another suggested I take the rest of the day off. The photos I'd taken on my phone were gone by the time I got home. Not deleted, not in recently removed, just empty space where they should have been. My call log showed the emergency call, but the timestamp was wrong, shifted by hours. When I went back to the cemetery that evening, the ground was smooth, undisturbed. No sign anything had ever been there. I tried to let it go, tried to believe them. Then the paperwork started changing. I requested a copy of the incident report. The first version mentioned my name, the second didn't. The third listed the call as noise complaint. Each time I asked for clarification, I got polite apologies and procedural language. Clerical error, system update, nothing to be concerned about. I started digging on my own. Old news clippings, archived police blotters, city maintenance logs. Once you know what to look for, patterns stand out. Calls made early in the morning. Cemeteries, construction sites, flood zones. Same language, same rapid response. Same conclusion, nothing found, no further action required. I found at least 7 incidents in the last 20 years that match what I'd seen. All closed within hours. All witnesses described as confused or mistaken. One name appeared more than once in the reports, always attached to supervisory approval. When I went to the station to ask about it, a senior officer asked me to step into a side office. He closed the door, smiled, lowered his voice. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said. "Some things are handled above your concern. You did the right thing calling it in. Now do the right thing and stop." He slid a document across the desk. A formal notice, case closed. It listed the incident date, location, and a resolution that didn't match reality. At the bottom was a signature I'd seen on multiple reports. I tried to expose it anyway. I emailed journalists, filed public records requests, posted anonymously online. Every attempt stalled. Emails bounced. Requests were denied for reasons that contradicted each other. One journalist called me back, voice tense, and told me not to contact him again. He wouldn't say why. That's when the surveillance started. Unmarked cars parked across from my apartment. The same 2 officers showing up at places I frequented, always polite, always coincidentally there for something else. My mail arrived already opened. My internet cut out at odd hours. Every time I complained, I received another notice, another stamped form, another calm assurance that nothing was wrong. Last week, a certified letter arrived at my door. Inside was a final report, case closed. Same incident, same wording, same signature. But attached was a note, handwritten this time. "We appreciate your cooperation. The thing is, the ground at the cemetery has started sinking again. And this time I didn't call anyone. They already know. We hired Evan because everyone said you needed someone like him if you were going to spend the night in a cemetery that old." The listing for the guided overnight tour made it sound respectable. Historical night walk, restricted access, experienced guide provided. It wasn't marketed as a ghost tour, which was important to us. We were there for research, local folklore, burial practices, mapping older grave sections before redevelopment. Evan came recommended by name on multiple forums. Knows the grounds better than anyone. Been doing this for years. Calm under pressure. When we met him at the gate, he looked exactly like someone you'd trust. Late 40s, neat beard, practical boots. He wore a radio clipped to his vest, carried a laminated map folded so many times it looked soft, and had the kind of voice that never rushed. He shook our hands, remembered our names, joked lightly about the cold. "Rule number 1, he said, smiling, "stay where I can see you. These grounds aren't dangerous if you respect them." That confidence settled us immediately. He talked as we walked. About burial customs. About how sections were added over time. About which headstones marked plague pits, which families paid extra for stone imported from Europe. He pointed things out before we noticed them, warned us about uneven ground before anyone stumbled. When he said something, it sounded like fact, not opinion. We followed him without question. The minor deviation started quietly. He took us off the marked path just for a moment, to show us an older crypt. He switched off his flashlight occasionally, explaining how artificial light ruined night vision. He adjusted the route, claiming a fallen tree blocked the way he'd originally planned. None of it felt wrong, not at first. What felt strange was how the radios behaved. We'd brought our own for backup, but Evan insisted we keep them off unless he told us otherwise. "Too much chatter confuses people," he said, "especially out here." When one of the others, Hannah, asked why his radio never crackled like ours did, he smiled and said, "Better equipment." As the night deepened, the cemetery seemed to stretch. Rows of graves felt longer than they should have been. Familiar landmarks vanished. Evan never hesitated. He always knew where to go, even when the map in his hands didn't seem to match what we were seeing. At some point, I realized we were no longer together as a group. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden separation. Just distance. Evan positioned himself between us, slowing one person, urging another forward. He spoke quietly, individually, giving slightly different instructions to each of us. "Stay close. Wait here a second. I'll catch you up." When I mentioned it, he laughed softly. "You're imagining things were all right here?" But we weren't? The doubt sharpened when Evan mentioned my grandfather. He brought him up casually while we were passing a row of unmarked stones. "Your grandfather would have liked this section," he said. "He always cared about the forgotten ones." I stopped walking. I hadn't told him about my grandfather. No one had. The only record of his burial was decades old in a different cemetery entirely. When I asked Evan how he knew that, he didn't look surprised. "You mentioned him earlier," he said smoothly. I hadn't. After that, his tone changed. Still calm, still friendly. But there was something underneath it now, like patience wearing thin. He corrected us more sharply, kept us closer. When someone lagged, he touched their arm a little too firmly. The revelation came when we reached the oldest section. The stones there weren't carved with names, just symbols. Evan stopped talking entirely as we entered. His flashlight angled low. The air felt dense, pressing in. My radio flickered to life without me touching it, a low hum pulsing like breath. Evan turned to face us. "You've done very well," he said, and the words felt rehearsed. "Most people don't make it this far without panicking." That's when I noticed the map. It wasn't a map of the cemetery. It was a diagram. Circles, lines, positions marked where we were standing, where we had stood before. The routes weren't about guiding us through history. They were about placing us. The confrontation was brief and useless. When we backed away, the path behind us wasn't there anymore. He even didn't chase us. He didn't need to. He simply stepped aside, gesturing toward the stones. "I don't take people here," he said quietly. "I bring them. I don't know how I got out. I remember running, tripping, hearing the radio whisper my name in Evan's voice. I remember daylight and police questions that went nowhere. No guide named Evan in their records. No permit for tours. No, I was the only one who made it home. Months later, I was scrolling through a forum, trying not to think about cemeteries at all when I saw a familiar name. Experienced overnight guide available. Restricted access. Respectful tours. The profile photo showed Evan smiling calmly, radio clipped to his vest. The comments were glowing, and the dates were current. The cemetery bell rang every morning at 6. That's what they told me when I took the job, not if it rang, when. Like sunrise or frost, or the way the fog always pooled between the eastern graves first. It was just part of the routine. They said, and routines were important in a place like this. I was hired as a maintenance assistant. Groundskeeping, light repairs, opening and closing gates. Simple work, predictable. After years of unstable jobs, I craved predictable. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and the supervisor, Mrs. Calder, spoke with the calm authority of someone who had done the same thing every day of her life and survived it. On my first morning, she handed me a clipboard and walked me through the tasks. Unlock the gates at dawn, check the bell tower rope for fraying, walk the perimeter path clockwise, pause at each section marker, ring the bell once before leaving. Don't rush, she told me. Timing matters. That phrase stuck with me. She used it often. Timing matters. If I asked why we waited exactly 10 seconds at each marker, she said timing mattered. If I asked why the bell had to be rung by hand instead of the electric backup, same answer. Not defensive, not secretive, just certain. The learning phase was casual, almost friendly. Other workers corrected me gently when I missed a step. "You forgot the phrase," one of them said the second week, smiling like I'd forgotten to say bless you after a sneeze. The phrase was simple. We said it under our breath, barely audible. Rest easy. Always the same words, always after the bell. At first I didn't think anything of it. Cemeteries are full of rituals that look strange from the outside. Respect, tradition, comfort for the living. I normalized it quickly, the way you do when everyone else treats something as ordinary. The repetition settled into my body. Clockwise steps, 10-second pauses. Bell rope rough against my palm. Rest easy. I caught myself whispering it at home once, rinsing dishes, and laughed it off. The symbolism crept in slowly. I noticed that the pauses always happened facing inward, toward the graves, never outward. That the bell rope had small knots tied into it at uneven intervals, forcing my grip to land in the same places every time. That Mrs. Calder wore the same watch every day and checked it obsessively during rounds. I noticed the dates next. Certain days took longer. Certain days required 2 bell rings instead of 1. These days always coincided with something else's: storms, funerals, town anniversaries, even eclipses. No one announced the changes, we all just knew. When I asked how, a coworker shrugged. He said, "The ground tells you." That was the first time I felt real unease. I started keeping my own notes separate from the official logs. Times, variations, the exact words spoken. When I laid it all out, the pattern became undeniable. The routine aligned with dates tied to deaths that weren't marked anywhere in the cemetery records. Old fires, collapsed mines, a bus accident the town no longer talked about. The routine wasn't honoring the dead buried there. It was compensating for the ones who weren't. The hidden purpose revealed itself one night when I stayed late, long after the others left. I wanted to see what happened if the routine wasn't completed. If the bell didn't ring, if the phrase wasn't spoken. I skipped one marker, just one. The air changed immediately. The stillness thickened, pressing against my ears. From beneath the ground came a sound like breath pulled through wet cloth. The bell tower rope twitched on its own, fibers creaking as if something invisible had grabbed it and pulled. I ran. The next morning, Calder was waiting for me at the gate. She simply added an extra task to my clipboard. Corrective repetition. I was to walk the route twice. 2 bells, 2 phrases. My resistance escalated after that. I tried refusing outright, tried quitting. My badge reappeared in my locker the next day. I stopped ringing the bell entirely. That night something rang it for me. The sound was wrong, too deep. It echoed through the cemetery long after the bell stopped moving. Every grave marker vibrated in response. I felt it in my teeth. Consequences came fast. Sinkholes opened near the perimeter. Animals were found buried alive in shallow pits, arranged carefully facing inward. Mrs. Calder aged overnight, lines carving deeper into her face, her hands shaking as she checked her watch. Timing matters, she whispered to me, eyes wild. "If you won't do it, someone else will." I left the job the next day, packed up, moved across town. I told myself it was over. It wasn't. The bell still rings every morning at 6. I hear it faintly through my walls, even though I'm miles away. Last week, I drove past the cemetery out of some morbid need to see it again. There were people there I didn't recognize, new workers, volunteers, walking the path clockwise, pausing at each marker. One of them rang the bell. All of them whispered, perfectly in sync, "Rest easy." And the ground, just for a moment, sounded satisfied. Before anything went wrong, my life was steady in a way I'd worked hard to earn. My wife Mara and I lived across from Green Heaven Cemetery, close enough that we could see the tops of the old oaks and the angel statues from our kitchen window. It wasn't morbid. It was quiet, peaceful. Mara liked to joke that the neighbors were polite and never complained. She jogged through the cemetery every morning, said the paths were calming, that the dead made better company than the living. Nothing about us was dramatic. We had routines. Coffee at 7. Notes left on the counter when one of us worked late. Sunday walks along the fence line. That normalcy is what makes everything else unbearable, because when things change slowly, you don't know where to point the blame. The first shift was her mood. Mara came home one evening unusually quiet. Not tired, just muted. She kissed my cheek a second too late, like she'd forgotten the timing. When I asked how her run was, she hesitated before answering, eyes unfocused. "Fine," she said. Same as always, it wasn't. She stopped jogging through the cemetery after that. Said she preferred the treadmill. She started sleeping on her back, rigid hands folded over her chest, something she'd never done before. When I joked about it, she smiled politely, like she didn't quite understand the joke. The physical inconsistencies followed. A scar appeared on her left palm. Thin, pale, precise. I knew every mark on her body. That scar hadn't been there. When I asked about it, she looked down at her hand, surprised, then shrugged. "Old thing," she said. "You just never noticed." Her handwriting changed next. Grocery lists became neater, rounder. Her signature on a delivery receipt looked practiced, like someone imitating familiarity. She stopped biting her nails, a habit she'd had since childhood. She started drinking her coffee black, even though she used to drown it in cream. Everyone else insisted nothing was wrong. Her sister laughed when I brought it up. "People change," she said. "You're being dramatic," our friends agreed. Mara herself listened patiently, eyes soft, reassuring me in a way that made me feel foolish for doubting her. That was the gaslighting, not cruel, not aggressive. Gentle, constant, like being wrapped in a blanket that slowly suffocates you. I started keeping track. I went through old videos on my phone, birthday parties, holidays, casual recordings where Mara laughed loudly, interrupted people, fidgeted constantly. I compared them to the woman sitting across from me at dinner, who chewed carefully, spoke only when spoken to, and never laughed with her mouth open anymore. The proof was undeniable to me. But proof only matters if someone else will look at it. One night while Mara showered, I checked her phone. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed confirmation I wasn't losing my mind. The messages went back years intact, except for one gap. 3 days, no texts, no calls, nothing. The same 3 days she'd last jogged through the cemetery. When I asked her about it, she didn't deny it. She sat down across from me, folding her hands, always that careful folding, and told me I was asking the wrong questions. "I'm still Mara," she said. "That's what matters." I asked her what that meant. Her expression flickered then, just briefly, like a mask slipping. "There was an accident," she said. "Not the kind you'd understand. Something took an interest, something needed continuity." I asked her where my wife was. She didn't answer directly. "She isn't suffering," she said instead. "She's resting." That was important. I screamed. I don't remember what I said. I remember knocking over a chair. I remember her flinching, not from fear, but from confusion, like she didn't expect that reaction. The loss settled in afterward, heavy and final. No body, no funeral, just absence wrapped in familiarity. The woman wearing my wife's face continued our life seamlessly. She went to work. She answered to Mara's name. She remembered shared stories, though sometimes the details were slightly off, like second-hand knowledge, and no one else noticed. Over time, she grew more convincing. The pauses shortened. The smiles warm. If I didn't know better, I might have believed her. Some days I almost do. That scares me more than anything. Last night I found something in the bathroom drawer. My toothbrush had been replaced, same brand, same color, but the bristles were dry, unused. Mine was gone. In its place was a folded note written in that careful, unfamiliar handwriting. "You adapt faster than she did." From the bedroom I heard her call my name, voice gentle, loving, perfectly practiced. And for the first time I couldn't remember if I'd always sounded the same either.